You may have heard about CityWorks Expo. For years now, we've been bringing people together to share big ideas for better places. Expo connects innovators across the community and around the globe through an ongoing series of events, conferences, and social media. And our goal is to inspire and support people like you, the ones who have a passion for making their neighborhoods, communities, and cities better places to live, work, and play. Check us out at cityworksxpo.com to learn more. Become a part of the Expo community and share your story. You never know who you will inspire with your big ideas.
It is true. I spent the first 20 years of my life here, first third of my life here, and I then went on a journey for the last 40 years, for 2/3 of my life, and it is true that I arrived on that airplane yesterday, and this will always be home. I am going to ask, if we can, to see if we can get the house lights up a little bit without ruining the video. Just, can we keep going? I hate not being able to see you. And I'm going to actually start for a second because I think it would be important, more than I've seen, for us to know who we are. This is a room, I'm sure, of change makers, but everyone is doing that in a very different way. So I'm going to ask you to stand up. I'm going to give you some categories and ask you to just stand up and see who's here. So if you have ever run for or held political office, please stand. If you have ever worked in a political, you can stand, you'll probably stand again, but just go ahead and sit down. If you've ever worked in a political campaign to try to get someone elected, stand up. Okay, great, lots of people. Okay, if you have started your own business, started and run your own business, stand up. Wait, wow. If you consider yourself, first and foremost, a community activist, grassroots community organizer, stand up. Okay, great. I wonder how many of these people, I should have actually had people stay, how many people are the same thing? How about if you define yourself primarily as an artist? Wow, wonderful. And how about if you work full-time for a nonprofit? Okay, good. This is what makes this conference, I think, so special, is everybody has in common trying to create change in their own way, but the ways are all really different, and there's so many amazing connections. As I've been listening, I think this conference is about, it's deeply, obviously, about creativity, but I think it's also about voice. It's about people finding and sharing their voice, and about places finding their voice in new ways. It's very clear to me that this place is very different. And it reminds me of what I want to talk about, which is that it's not exactly news that change is hard. I don't think it's as obvious that change is also hard for change makers. And I mean that in two senses. Creating sustainable, terrific change that we all want to see is hard. We're hearing lots of stories about it. But it's also hard to change yourself if you're a change maker, to examine your assumptions, to change course, to try new things. And all of us here, a lot of these presentations are about the what of change, whether it's the incredible transformation of this downtown that slowly happened, that Ed has been so much a part of, or the structural racism that is the original sin of this country. It's the what is important. But the how is rarely talked about in the same way. There's been a little bit of how this morning because we've talked about copying, which I loved, steal. But what I want to do is share some of the reflections that I have made about how profound change happens, what I've learned in the last 40 years. And I apologize because this, in the sense that this conference is so incredibly practical and concrete. This is going to kind of go up a level. And I hope it's actually as practical as some of the other things, but it will require a change of gears. And I am going to do something that I have not ever done, which is I'm not going to show slides. I've probably given 100 speeches in different parts of the world, including on the main TED stage. And the polish and the practice and all of that is antithetical to how I feel right now. I feel raw. I feel in a reflective space. And Ed promised me that it was okay that I could explore and try something new. So I'm going to just talk, and I'm going to ask you to talk and speak. I have many things in my mind and heart. I'm going to do this 4 ways. I'm first going to orient you to where I'm coming from, because everybody is coming from a different place. I want you to know a little bit about the experience that I base my opinions on. The second thing I'm going to do is try to do a kind of top 10 list, which is my evergreens that I think are true about creating change. And then I'm going to very briefly talk about how I think change is changing, because how you apply the tried and true things is different in the world as it is today. And then if we have time, I'm going to share a little tool that I recently came across that I think is the way to unlock many things. One of the hardest things in creating change is how the old and the new live at the same time, and how you get people to let go of the old and accept the new that isn't clear. I've come across this little tool that I plan to use and I think might be useful to you. Now, in the incredibly anti-TED, low-tech way, I've actually created a handout. I love going to conferences and walking away with things, and so rather than flashing things for you in slides, there's a handout. And so there's actually 2 pieces of paper. And while I orient you to my story, this is for the second part of the talk, the evergreens. Just everybody get the piece of paper, and then I'm going to quickly walk you through it. So I believe deeply in the possibility of transformative change. That has been my life, and I'm sure that it is the lives of most of you in the room, which is why you're here. In growing up here, my life was profoundly influenced by social movements, by the civil rights movement and by the women's movement. I was 15 years old in 1970. That means I missed the 1960s, but I spent most of the 70s trying to figure out what had happened. I believe deeply, from everything I have learned about from deep social movements and from my own life, that I embrace the famous thing that Frederick Douglass said, the abolitionists in the 19th century: power never conceded anything without a demand. It never has, and it never will. And I think the story we heard about Carillion and the creation of the sustainability officer yesterday, I think there were a lot of things in between the lines of that story we didn't hear about how hard it was, but it was a great example of really pushing against a power structure to get it to change. Having been at the moment that I was growing up and the things that were happening, things were beginning to change very rapidly for women. And I needed to leave here. I needed to leave the South. It was suffocating to someone like me. And I sometimes have come to say that I was a Southern belle who never rang. But I also, so I left and I went to school and I came back and I became a reporter in North Carolina in Greensboro. And I lived in Greensboro for a long time, and somebody once told me becoming a young journalist is like your graduate school is the world. And I went to 50 meetings of the Guilford County Commissioners. And I went to school board meetings, and I covered an entire session of the North Carolina General Assembly And one of the most memorable characters I met was an amazing man named, his name Gaston Faison. They called him Brother. And Brother had run for office in Guilford County because he was an alcoholic, and he had stopped drinking, and he really wanted to help other people. He's a very colorful man. So this is 1979, and I called up Brother one morning at 7 a.m., because that's what you did when you were writing for the afternoon newspaper, trying to figure out a news story for the day. And Brother said, "Well, how are you, Catherine?" And I said, "Well, Brother, I haven't been very good. I haven't been feeling that well. I've been in bed for a few days." And he said, "Who was the lucky fella?" And so the young feminist in me was like, I wanted to really? But you just kind of learn in being in a community that that's not how, he didn't mean any harm by that. And I learned the most incredible amount of things about how the world works and how power works from the ground up, being there as a young person. And then at 27, I decided to start a newspaper in North Carolina with some other people. It would now be called a social enterprise. We didn't use that language then. And it was called the North Carolina Independent, and it went through many business models. And I thought I was going to be a newspaper editor. What I really was a business person and learning how to run a small business. And learning the complexity of that. I love the spirit of this conference. It's so optimistic and can-do. And many, many things in the world would never happen without that. And I learned about that. I learned what you can accomplish through force of will. But I also learned in that period of 10 years what you can't accomplish through force of will. So we would do these world-class, award-winning national investigative stories on Jesse Helms, and really win these big national prizes. And then we would walk in to the local hardware store to sell an ad to a guy who voted for Jesse Helms. And the complexity of that reality of mission, holding mission and a viable business, I don't care if it's a nonprofit or a business, they all wrestle with that. And of course, the 80s were the time that entrepreneurial culture really caught fire in this country. Steve Jobs was showing up on the cover of magazines, and we sort of moved from the social movements to the movement of business as the solution that has really, carried forward for a long time. I then decided to leave journalism. I wanted to work side by side with people solving problems instead of writing about it. And at 40, I changed careers. And I had discovered this thing called the internet in 1992, and I figured out that it was going to change everything that I cared about. And I moved to California. And along the way, I had discovered that I kept falling in love with women, and this was not an accident. And so I was coming to terms with this, and I had said to myself, I'm going to stay where I am from until I can be completely myself, which I did. I didn't run away, but it was too darn hard, ultimately. And in the mid-90s, I thought, we should just move to a city. And I got this amazing opportunity to go to California and work with these people at a place called Global Business Network. The man who did the Whole Earth catalog that some of you may have heard of, Stuart Brand, ran the Global Business Network. And we moved to California, and I just have to tell you, one wonderful story. In North Carolina in the early 1990s, it was not possible to be together in a same-sex relationship and have the system know how to deal with you. So I owned the cars, and my partner was the second driver on the shows, and she owned the house, but we didn't own anything together. And we moved to California. First day, we were in Berkeley, and it was a dark, rainy Monday afternoon, and I walked into the AAA office to get car insurance because I couldn't get a license without all this. And so I walk into the office, and this poor woman is I'm her last customer, and she looks at the paper and she says, She says, you're in California now. You like to do this differently. It's okay. And I burst into tears. I still burst into tears thinking about it. It was like this insurance salesman woman was actually thought it was just fine if we wanted to own the car together, be on the thing together. So I've never looked back. Moving to California in 1995 was an amazing thing. And I have been I've had a ringside seat to some of the biggest changes on the planet in the last 20 years. And that no journalist and no life as a reporter could have given me. A few examples. I was in the room in the Santa Fe Institute in 1996 when the first multi-sector think tank, citizens coming to help the Pentagon and the CIA think about the changing nature of national security. And we were doing scenarios on the future of national security, and it was the first time somebody, everybody's focused on China. This is after the Cold War, and it's like, we don't have Russia as an enemy. We did this scenario where the biggest the threat to national security in the United States was going to be the super empowered individual. And it was so radical that you could barely wrap your head around it. And within 5 years, of course, we had 9/11. I was in room after room with newspapers and public broadcasting and people in the 90s and to the late 90s trying to come to grips with technology and the changes in technology, breaking my heart over and over and over again because they were so in denial. And the worst example I ever saw of that was the chairman of Kodak in 1997, in which I watched him look at an image for then what was early digital photography. And it was hard to do. You had to use computers, and the quality wasn't any good. And he said, that'll never take off. And then most recently, an example of I do a lot of work for large philanthropic foundations like Rockefeller and Ford. And my favorite one is recently has been the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that adopted a completely new vision called a culture of health, going from we have to fix medical care to we have to have medical care and health to we actually have to move to a preventive, more community-based model of health. That's going to be a profound change. It's going to take at least a generation. But I've literally had dozens of these experiences, and it reminds me of the thing when I was a young person that I used to say is I'm too much of a journalist to be a scholar, too much of a scholar to be an activist, and too much of an activist to be a journalist. And so I constantly have this tendency to be, to go very, very broad. And the result of that is that I think the story of my life is a constantly expanding consciousnness. And I say that, and I tell you that story because I am sure of only one thing, and that is that the future of all the places everyone in this room cares about is, of course, in our hands, but is profoundly not in our hands as well. Because we're in the grip of some very large forces beyond our control that are going to cause require all of us to learn and expand and grow in our hearts and in our minds and our ideas. A friend of mine says we don't live in an age of change, we live in a change of age. And if you just think for a moment about the profound changes in the economy that no one quite understands yet, what's happened to the disappearance of jobs and what it's going to take to create good jobs in the future in a global interconnected economy. If you think about the climate, if you think about the technology, if you think about the profound demographic shift. In California, in the last few months, whites are now fewer in number than Latinos. And that change, the change in demographics, it will happen through the next decades. The status quo is not an option. Now, you guys are all dedicated to that because that's what you're doing to disrupt your communities. But we have to get a lot better than we currently are at how to make this happen. And so I have collected a starting list, and it's just a starting list. I know you're going to add to it and change it, of these kind of what I think of as my self-help curriculum for change artists. And I hope there's something here that speaks to your dreams and realities. I'm going to walk through them really quickly, and then I'm going to ask you to have a conversation about them. And this is the handout. Should be a one-page handout. It's got 10 things on it. Has everybody got that? The first thing is develop a point of view and hold it lightly. I love this. In a country where where it seems like everybody's getting in these, polarized positions and everybody's listening to only the people that they know, certainly in our national politics, we need an anchor of a point of view. You need to have, in all the swirling things around, you need a point of view, but you need to hold it lightly. And you need to be able to shift it and change it. The poet Antonio Machado said, wander there is no path, make the path by walking. And part of the walking at times is deeply challenging your own assumptions. One of my favorite people in the world is a man named Michael Lerner at a center called Commonweal in California. And he's not Michael Lerner, the rabbi. There's also a different Michael Lerner. He was one of the very first MacArthur Award winners in the very first year, and he's in his 70s now, so he was profoundly influenced by the politics of the 60s and movements, and grew up thinking that corporations were evil and business was bad. And he recently said to me, I was completely wrong about business and about markets and about the power of those to create great change. I love that when people are willing to be a hungry learner in that way and to admit that they were wrong. So that's number one. Number two, make new mistakes. Now, this is exactly playing on the presentation about copying earlier. I mean this in both senses. You can't do anything and not make mistakes. I mean, you have to start something new, things aren't going to go well. But today, there's no excuse for making a mistake that's been made over and over and over again. I mean, and one of the big problems for a long time in social change is that people just, constantly reinventing the wheel and doing the stuff that's already been done over and over again. No excuse for that anymore. Make new mistakes, copy, borrow, learn from others. And it's hard because as grown-ups, we all learn from our own experience. But we don't have time to waste to spend 2 or 3 or 4 years learning something that somebody's already learned. I've always loved, one of the first things I learned at Global Business Network, this incredible boutique consultancy that I went to work at 20 years ago, some of the best learners are actually in the military. And there was a great book called Military Misfortunes, and the book said that there were 3 kinds of failure. Failure to learn from the past, failure to adapt in the present, failure to anticipate the future. And I always thought that was such a nice distillation of the types of learning, and because all change depends on learning, and that depends on applying the lessons of failure. 3, wisdom is knowing the difference between doing things right and doing the right thing. This is often attributed to various management consultants, and it's a profound thing because you go into a situation where people want to get better, and often what happens is a set of incremental changes. Sometimes that's what's needed, but a lot of times you need to more step back and more fundamentally look at your assumption. One of the funniest and most powerful examples in history was when the steamship was invented in the 19th century. The first reaction of sailing ships was to improve, put more sails on, and do all these things, and you get these Baroque-looking boats. The pictures are drawings of these are very funny, but they were doing the wrong thing right. There were more improvements in sailing ships in the first 20 years of steamships than in all of the history before. But of course, they were doing the wrong thing. It was nothing, improving the sailing ship was not going to be the point. They had to actually shift and change. And I think that the thing I would ask you to think about in any given situation is that. The management consultant Peter Drucker said the greatest danger in terms of turbulence is not the turbulence, it's to act with yesterday's logic. And I think given how fast the world is changing today, too often the things that we're doing, we're doing the wrong thing better. 4, ideas matter. You can often act your way into a new way of thinking. It sometimes is the only way. In the beautiful presentation we heard yesterday about Jonathan and his walking story. He found that he just had to walk. He just had to make that path by walking and do. And I think this is a room of people. That's what you do. But ideas matter, and I worry sometimes that we undervalue the necessity of better ideas. One of my favorite examples is a wonderful man some of you may know named Amory Lovins, who is one of the great environmentalist and a great pioneer of energy efficiency. When he was a young man in the 70s, he invented a new idea. It was called negawatts. Not megawatts, negawatts. And it was to dramatize at that moment that the way to deal with the energy problem wasn't just to build more megawatts. It was to figure out how to save energy so that we need it. So if you could measure it as negawatts. And so it was a very clever concept that convinced the California regulatory system to not allow PG&E to build new plants. And that was an idea. And I think holistic medicine, integrative medicine is another extremely powerful concept that's been coming on for a few decades and is going to get more and more powerful. We need a bunch of this type of creativity. Number 5, though, that said, facts on the ground often trump everything else. It's one of the reasons that you hear so much about first mover advantage. I love the famous Buckminster Fuller quote, which is here, which I'm sure many of you have heard. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. Boy, are we seeing that. So much technology driven now. I mean, Uber and current Fast Company magazine has an incredible cover story on Uber about the wanting to basically now disrupt public transportation and build a new model. I noticed that Uber is in Roanoke now. But music and phones, but it's not just technology. Think about the invention of Alcoholics Anonymous as a new model that made other previous ways of dealing with alcoholism obsolete. 6, context matters. And here I use the emblematic quote from my friend Stuart Brand: once a new technology rolls over you, if you're not part of the steamroller, you're part of the road. And this is actually really important for both sides of that. Because it's very easy to be in denial. I mean, I said newspapers broke my heart in the 90s. Room after room after room that I was in, we did everything we could to shake people up and say, the world is about to profoundly change. And there was a window when newspapers were making tremendous amounts of money, when investments could have been made in ways. But it's very hard to cannibalize your own business and do the things that they would have had to do. But they lost that window because they were in denial. And I think there's an awful lot of denial going on right now about the changes in the country and the current very disheartening presidential campaign. And I know I deeply hunger for somebody who will actually tell us what's going on and what we're actually going to do about it. But the other part of it's true as well, is figuring out what's happening and riding the wave, how to use the forces that are at work in favor of what you want to do. And some of the smartest strategies I've seen created by some of the greatest social entrepreneurs in America and the greatest philanthropic foundations are the ones that are figuring out not just how to push that rock up the hill, but how to get on the rock that's already going down. And if we just look around here in a completely different environment, Sweetbriar College, which is just down the road here, just tried to change itself, women's only college, and shut itself down. And the alumni, of which my mother was one, were up in arms, and they've agreed to keep it open. I can't imagine that they will succeed. That's too much against the flow of history, whereas you go up the road to Washington Lee or somebody who, the colleges that went co-ed a long time ago, I think that's a force of history I would not want to stand against. Not that there shouldn't be some women's colleges, but I think there should be, and I know there's a very good one in this community. So when can you use the forces of change, and when do you have to block them? 7, it's so much easier to see or dream or come up with an idea or an experiment than it is to execute well over time. I guarantee every single person in this room has experienced that. But if you think about the time it takes, the scope of an idea, the time it's going to take to execute it, and the resources it takes to execute it, if you get one of those three wrong, only one, you will not succeed in executing. And sometimes you just have to change the time frame, which means you have to get more resources, or you have to narrow the scope. And so people, keep shifting the strategy over time. I'm sure we all have our own examples of this, and I think I would say it's my greatest learning of the last 10 years, is how you get smarter and smarter about, in the midst of soaring dreams, getting people to be fully tough-minded about what it will take. Which leads me to the eighth thing, which is one of my favorite quotes of all time from the forecaster Paul Sappho. He said, "I grew up on a ranch, and so I know you can never mistake a clear view for a short distance. You can see much further, looks much closer than it actually is." And I heard a story recently, a heartbreaking story, but which really brought this home to me, from the great Nobel laureate, South African Episcopal Bishop Desmond Tutu, who said, somebody sat down with him, he was part of the changes in South Africa, and then he ran that incredible Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and somebody sat down with him like 20 years later after Nelson Mandela was elected and the Constitution was adapted, and sat down with him, just this year in 2015 and said, "So, what surprised you?" And he said, "Well, let me tell you a story. I got on a plane in Nigeria recently, and there were two black Africans flying the plane. And I just was so thrilled. This is what I've worked for all my life. I sat in my seat, and I just kind of pulled myself up, and I was so excited. There were black Africans flying this plane." And he said, and then we took off, and we got into incredible turbulence. Really the worst turbulence I had ever been in my life in an airplane. And my first thought was, there's no white man in that cockpit. And he said, it just took my breath away. And he said, and that's what is surprising, and we should have known. Never mistake a clear view for a short distance. Some things can be sped up, some things can't. It's taken decades, centuries to get that country in that hole. You're not going to get out in a few years or a few decades even. And so he was kind of talking to himself about what can you speed up and what can't you speed up. When do you need to be urgent and when do you need to be patient? I love there's one of my favorite organizations in America. It's called the Land Institute. It's run by a man named Wes Jackson in the Midwest. And what I love about it, they're trying to create a completely new kind of wheat to save the prairies. And they have a 50-year strategic plan, 50. And they have a vision for a 50-year new kind of farm bill. And I think most things are possible in 50 years, if you think that long. But everybody wants a 3-year plan and to fund for a 3-year plan, and then the funders want to go to the next thing. And I just think most of the things that are worth doing take a lot longer. Number 9, all of that is true, all of that realism and practical thing, but you know what? In the very end, what really matters is imagination. I love this quote from Mary Oliver, "Make room in your heart for the unimaginable." If somebody had told me the day that we started the North Carolina Independent in 1982, what it would actually be like, what it would actually take to start an alternative newspaper in North Carolina in 1982, going against most of the trends of the culture, I think I would have turned and run the other way. So, there is something to just, and Paul Hawken, the wonderful environmentalist, says, do what needs to be done and check if it was impossible only after it was done. So in some ways, this is kind of counter to everything I just said, but it is it's an indispensable quality. If you had told me in 1994, when I sat at my dining room table with my partner and we exchanged wedding rings by ourselves because we couldn't imagine how to do it differently. And then in 2008, there was this moment when we could actually legally get married. And I actually believed I would never see that in my lifetime. a failure of my own imagination. But, there is something about sometimes things that look like they're tilting at windmills and are impossible actually turn out to be the thing that everybody needs to have their imagination ignited. And I think this conference is full of stories of that. And then finally, Jen actually started with this. I'm using a somewhat more, there are many things. The success of an intervention depends on the interior conditions of the intervener. I've seen this so many times, when an angry person or a bitter person might be trying to do exactly the right thing, but just can't move a room. And then somebody makes themselves vulnerable, opens their heart, changes everything. And joy and humility and openness, those qualities which only can happen in community, are transformative. I think the Pope just gave us a master class in this. It just sort of transcended a lot of things. And I heard of and saw a recent example of this that I found terribly moving. I was in a room. I live in the wine country in California now, and so I live in Sonoma, California. And I've joined the Community Foundation Board in Sonoma to get involved in the same kind of local and community change that you guys are all involved in. And I was in a room where they were starting to wrestle with the need to deal with the divide in the community. There's a Latino community, and there's a white community, and there's tremendous economic inequality just like there is everywhere. And this very brave Latino man came in to speak to this group and describe what he thought was going to be necessary to create change. And this very rich, powerful, just almost stereotypical rich, powerful white man attacks him and says, well, we tried to do this to help you, and we tried to do that to help you, and it was like, you just kind of just like, this is exactly what he's talking about. Like, there wasn't a lot of listening. It was like, here's what we think you need, and we're going to give it to you. And I then went and had lunch with this beautiful man named Oscar Chavez, and he told me, I called John, and I took him to lunch. Because I don't believe there's such a thing as an other. That's what Oscar Chavez said. I have come to believe that stereotypes of all kinds are evil. They're just evil. We don't take the time to understand the real human being behind the stereotype. It doesn't matter who it is, left, right, center. So there is something about the orientation of your spirit when you're trying to change. That is my initial top 10. I could probably give you 10 more, and I'm sure you have 10 more beyond that. What I'm going to ask you to do is turn to somebody next to you. It can be somebody you know or somebody you don't know. And just pause for a moment and tell each other, was there something here that resonated? Was there a story that you had about one of these things? Or maybe there's something completely different that you've been sitting there thinking about, and just share that. And then let's hear some of those stories for a few minutes. Let's hear some of your stories. So please, talk. It would be so incredibly lovely if a few people would share what they were thinking about or a story from their own experience. We've got a couple of mics here, and we can bring them around to you. Here's one right back here.
Yeah, my name's Al Henry. Is Pete Eshelman here? Take what I'm going to say from the borrowing and stealing speech today, because we're getting ready to do some serious borrowing and stealing here in Roanoke. One of the things, I'm a native Roanoker, left for a number of years, went away, and just recently came back. And one of the things that I noticed when I came back between the intervening years was the sort of explosion in the recognition of our outdoor assets here, which to me is one of the great things about this place. And in fact, we have some of the greatest outdoor assets in the country, certainly on the East Coast. As a cyclist, and there are probably lots of cyclists here in this room, you may have heard of an event in Texas called Hell Week. It's an event where serious cyclists get together for a week and get ready for the summer cycling season. And we looked at that, and we started thinking, well, why couldn't we borrow that? Why couldn't we do that here? What have they done that works? What have they done that we could maybe do better? So in a series of discussions with Roanoke Outdoors and Roanoke Outside and Pete Eshelman, we're bringing Hill Week here to Roanoke for next year, to bring cyclists from all over, actually the Northern Hemisphere, because a lot of Canadians need training space in the spring. So we'll be sort of tagging on to the Blue Ridge Marathon, bringing some really hardcore cyclists here to cycle for a week next spring, and borrowing ideas from our friends and colleagues in Texas.
That's great.
That's fantastic. Y'all
Who
come
else
back.
got one over here?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Michaela Ayorinde, and my husband and I rode in here from Charlotte, North Carolina. And I just wanted to share some of my quick takeaways. I first want to let you know, I want to admit that I came somewhat prejudiced to this expo. I've been to lots of things like this. I've not been to this particular expo. And I really was just like, oh my gosh, this is just going to be one of these talk things. And everyone just patting themselves on the back for talking. And I really love, first of all, I appreciate the relative diversity in the room. I wanted to tell you that I really appreciate number 10 on the list that you have here. I'm a visual and a performing artist for social change in Charlotte, North Carolina, and a lot of times I'll get in the room, and I've been in the room of very influential people that are talking about a lot of things, and at the end of it, I stand up and I put my hand on my hip and I make some obvious, poignant comment about the pink elephant in the room that, but actually, are we doing anything though? I'm just wondering. And so I appreciate hearing and seeing the things that people are doing. Mm-hmm. And my takeaway from this particular commentary, I want to really commend you and appreciate you're doing something different and sharing your vulnerability. I really, really value that. And my takeaway from it is the bitter is not better. The success of an intervention depends on the interior conditions of the intervener. And, a lot of times I really want for change, but having my hand on my hip and being really pissed about it does not, for some reason, bring it about. So, I appreciate your standing and being yourself and sharing, from your heart and seeing how that can really make a difference. And
that's a great, bitter is not better. That's good. Let's hear one or two more. Got one back here. Yeah.
Hi, how's it going? My name is Curtis Roulette. I am a student at Virginia Tech. Thank you. Go Hokies. Working with students at Virginia Tech, one of the main points I especially took away from this session was probably creating develop a point of view and holding on to it lightly. Especially what you said in the beginning about this generation, how everyone holds on to their opinions and how everyone holds on to their ways extremely hard and everything like that is something that I kind of value myself. I have strong opinions and I'm really ready to voice them, but going to a school and living in a region like this, you meet a lot of people talked to a lot of people, say a lot of things. And yeah, I'm happy to say that point of views can change, and I'm an example of that. So thank you.
Good, thank you. Let's hear one more. We're gonna do I am gonna do a lunch, and and I hope this conversation will just keep going. Let's do one more. Right here, yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Jeremy Stutz. I'm here from Santa Monica, California, and I'm just visiting. It's my 4th year at Expo, and I always come listening to different ideas. My dad actually moved to Roanoke, and I love this city. But I also wanted to talk about number 10 on the list, that the success of an intervention lies within the interior qualities of the intervener. I do a lot of work in Santa Monica advocating on behalf of transit-oriented development, as well as just increased housing in general. And there's a lot of fear within my local community, especially within older generations, of taller buildings, of the increased density and traffic, and honestly of the other, bringing in people when you're talking about affordable housing that they don't necessarily want in the community. And to be honest, when I've gone in front of city council and heard remarks that hint towards that, in my heart, I have not been listening. I've been listening to mock or listening to kind of laugh off what they've been saying. But if I truly want to address the issues at hand and truly want to build community, their perspectives are also incredibly important. And it's important to kind of get down off of my perspectives, my understanding, and stop thinking, I know what's really right, but step down and say, what's informing that perspective? What is it that in your daily life makes you feel that way? And maybe there's some common ground that we can find. And at the end of it, maybe we don't agree, but it's certainly more productive than sitting in a room and yelling at each other or accusing people of different things, which oftentimes happens at City Council in Santa Monica.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's true here too. I just thought that was extremely valuable. So I wanted to thank you for highlighting that. As we learn lessons that bring about change, I think that's a critical one for me.
Great. Well, thank you. What you were just talking about is the power of it's in the OD, organizational development world, is called inquiry versus advocacy. So the power of inquiring as opposed to advocating, and the power of empathy. I have come to believe, and I think I would say deeply through my own life, that so many things are only unlocked by healing. And so often what comes at you is from people when it's about resistance is fear or pain, and really understanding and meeting each other and inquiring about that for each other. To say one more sort of personal thing about the journey of falling in love with a woman in 1974 for the first time, and dealing with that, I sometimes say that the story of my life can be told in 3 phrases. First, I was ashamed. Then I was ashamed of being ashamed. And then I healed. And I think many of us have a version, that's my personal version of that, but I think many people have a version of that. And I think healing happens in community, which is why there's so much power in the starting from the grassroots in places the way people are doing here. I want to do 2 more quick things, really quick. I have been trying to think recently about something I call how change is changing. And I'm pretty sure I'm going to need to do some writing about it. And it's actually a whole nother talk. But I want to tell you 3 quick things to keep in mind, because I think it is part of the contextual context for nearly everything that people in the room are doing. So that, and the first one is this sort of big, long-term, historic shift in the relationship among the sectors between government, business, and the nonprofit sector. The nonprofit sector has grown exponentially in the last 30 years in this country to become professionalized and big and in all kinds of ways. There are too many nonprofits, actually, too many doing the same thing. But we, in the century we are in, there will need to be a new social contract, and it will involve all three sectors. And actually, what is fascinating is all the varieties of hybrids that are getting invented here and around the world. So by that I mean things that are public-private this, and social enterprise that are businesses, and nonprofits that earn revenue, and and it's different for different places and issue areas, but there's so much exciting experimentation going on to invent the thing that that is going to have to replace a lot of what did work in the 20th century that's not working and won't work in this century. And we certainly can't rely on Congress to fix it for us anytime soon. And it's beyond ideology. It is so much about what works, which is why it starts in communities. But large corporations are getting involved in and thinking about their role in responsibility in lots of new ways. It may or may not be happening here, but I promise you it's happening. Monitor Institute is now part of Deloitte Consulting, which is the largest consulting company in the world, works for the Global 1000, and we see evidence of it all the time. And so watch that space and understand that the experimentation that's going on in cities is so important because it's where most of the new ideas are going to be invented. To borrow the phrase from the early 20th century, you are the laboratories of democracy. The second thing is a profound and at a very early stage, the new ability to organize without organizations. And we've seen very powerful examples of this in recent years, from the Tea Party to Occupy to the Arab Spring to hashtag Black Lives Matter. It's just a few examples. And we're very, we like to call them swarms. There's something about their sort of self-organizing ability. But we're in a very early stage of how it is that institutions that we keep breaking down and not trusting are going to relate to these things which pop up and go away and have no ability to make change sustain. The institutions are often stuck, not adapting enough, need the energy of new populations and new ideas. And the relationship between these things is where a lot of the action is going to be. Between institutions and self-organized, I'm going to call them swarms. But capturing that energy and channeling it in productive ways is going to be critical. The last thing I want to mention about how change has changed is a little harder to describe, but I think is actually possibly the most important. And that's kind of where the sweet spot of change is today. So if you look at the last 40 years and 50 years and the ways that social movements and larger things were going after big systems change, and people love to talk about systems change. And people got, as the world shifted to business in the post-Reagan era, and social movements kind of faded away, and everything became about effective organizations, and whether businesses or nonprofits. And our consulting practice, this is where social entrepreneurship comes from. It's like, the heroic social entrepreneur has an idea, goes out and does it, right? And what we've seen over the last 15 years of working with many of the greatest of these social entrepreneurs in America is that most of them are now, have hit a wall and say, you know what, it was really great, we built a great organization, we scaled it, but the problem is still this big, and we're this big. So systems are too big to get your arms around, and organizations are too small. So somehow there's this sweet spot in the middle. I began to get a hint of this some years ago when an amazing man in Scotland wrote this line: top-down doesn't work, but bottom-up doesn't add up. And I thought that was a really profound. Top-down doesn't work, bottom-up doesn't add up. And I think what's happening now is with the new technologies and all the things that you guys are doing in a conference like this, is about how we make the bottom-up add up. The craze over the language of collective impact. Fields, places, cities, industries, domains, ecologies, ecosystems. This is the language, the very arcane, but this is the language of social change today as people try to find a way to get organizations and people to band together in new ways, to use the power to make bottom-up add up without relying on centralized planning or somebody from the top to say, here's how it is. Now, most profound change will require policy change and also bottom-up. But so watch that middle space. The very last thing, I just want to point you to the other handout, which is called the 3 Horizons. If you have, it's like a little handout. I just want to explain it to you, and I want to point you to the web and tell you why I'm so excited about having seen this. The same man who said top-down doesn't work, bottom-up doesn't add up, a man named Graham Lester, and he's run something called the International Futures Forum in Scotland for the last 10 years. And he's been doing experiments on the ground in Scotland, in communities, in small places, in how to deal with the fact that we're living inside of a lot of broken systems and trying to make them work, when actually they need to be reinvented. If you just think about education or healthcare, or the way we deliver healthcare and the way children are educated. So let me just point at you. So prevalence, time on the piece of paper. So big little point. And Horizon 1 is the things that are business as usual today. High on prevalence, and over time is going to fade away. That's just the shape of anything that's dominant. It's gonna fade away. But it's how we're educating today. It's how the hospitals are working. It's what we're doing to the environment. It's all the things that are happening today. Horizon 3 is the vision that we hold of what it should be better. Starts down here. It's not very prevalent. Over time, it's going to go like this. Most of the action in this room is now on Horizon 2, which is all the people who are trying to fix the things, start to fix the things that aren't working on Horizon 1, right? So you're in here and you're going like this. You're trying to do the experiments that you want to add up. And what's really interesting about this is that these are 3 completely valid orientations to the future. What Graham says they've been trying in Scotland for the last 10 years, within 10 minutes, putting that up transforms a conversation because people find themselves in the story. And the important thing is that the people who are today keeping the schools open and the hospitals open and doing the thing that's needed now, you can't just close all that stuff down. They often feel rejected by the innovators. They feel undervalued and unvalued, and I know I have made this mistake a lot of times. I've always been interested in innovation, and people feel that there's an oppositional quality. Sometimes there is, and there has to be, but rather than the people here seeing, oh, there's all these ideas out here that I could use, they feel rejected and undervalued. You see this in the efforts to reform public education a great deal with all the charter schools and what happens to the main public schools while all the energy goes into the Horizon 2 charter schools, where actually Horizon 3 is going to be learner-centered, technology-driven, a completely different way of doing education eventually. Meanwhile, we have to educate kids today, and people are doing their best to create other options, in the meantime. So the question is, almost going back to the interior condition of the change agent, the psychological wisdom of wherever you are in that, being able to look at those who are in a different place and bring them all on the same journey is an incredible wisdom. So that the people out here that the people who are out here doing the really radical new thing, you don't just say, oh, that's completely, that's just completely impractical, those are stupid people. And, that those of us who are over here don't look at the people who are keeping the doors open today and say, they just don't get it, right? There's just so much of that oppositional quality. So I would encourage you, if you are at all have a bent to think this way, it's all online, International Futures Forum. They have PowerPoints, they have a book, they have examples of the ways they've experimented with it to be able to go in a room and get people to have a different type of conversation. So change is hard. It's hard for change makers too. And I want you to notice the title, the metaphor of the title that I chose, which was Cultivating Change. Change can be about a battle, but a lot of what this presentation has been about is how to offer a slow, gentle process of trying and learning, and about adapting to the weather and the pests that you can't control, and working really hard and learning about the soil that you're tilling in your particular place, and how the sun moves on your horizon, and trust and having faith and staying with it for a long time. So whatever garden you're tilling, I hope there was something here for your toolbox. And I am sure that much will depend in the years ahead, not just on courage, not just on creativity, but on whether we can all learn faster and better together, which is why I'm so glad to be here. As Mary Oliver also said, my favorite poet and many people's favorite poet, be ignited or be gone. Thank you very much.